Welcome back. Now, Maajid Nawaz, a former member of the Hizb ut-Tahrir, is claiming that Pakistan can't tackle increasing radical Islamism by military actions alone. Rather, it needs to convince its politically diverse public of the importance of a moderate Islamic society functioning under a democratically elected government. An ex-militant recruiter himself, he knows full well the history of the movements of terrorist groups in and out of Pakistan. He was on the leadership committee of Hizb ut-Tahrir and sent to Pakistan to recruit people to help further the group's radical Muslim vision by force if necessary. And the scope of their recruitment isn't limited to society's downtrodden, but instead targets an educated and military elite. Well, Maajid Nawaz has been back to Pakistan on a tour of universities aimed at warning young Pakistanis about recruiters like himself operating on campus and in their social circles. Newseye spoke to him during his trip to find out how extremist groups are recruiting in Pakistan and why they think that countries like Pakistan are fair game for a military takeover. We agreed to play the interview after he left because of security concerns. In fact, he was attacked by a member of Hizb ut-Tahrir and received death threats during his stay in Pakistan. If we talk about Hizb ut-Tahrir first, the goal for Hizb ut-Tahrir is to create a unified transnational Islamist state. So by what means? They
focus on two areas in society. One is to convince the intelligentsia and the thought leaders of any society as to the validity of their cause. And this is in any country that they're working in that has a Muslim majority population. And the second, in specific countries that they feel are militarily strong enough, is to infiltrate the upper echelons of the army, to recruit people from the army and eventually convince them to implement a military coup on their behalf and take over that regime, change the entire system and place them into power.
Hizb ut-Tahrir, though, is publicly non-violent, but many say that that is just a facade, that it says it's non-violent, yet it tacitly advocates violence.
I think violence is where, because even a military coup is by definition a violent act, they are non-terrorist. That I'm convinced of. I was on their leadership. I know for a fact that they do not encourage terrorism and hence they should not be prescribed under terrorism legislation. However, that does not mean that they don't believe in violence full stop. There are two elements where violence gets involved. One is in the military coup itself, and the problem there is not necessarily in a dictatorship, but definitely in a democratic regime and a democratic setup. To overthrow a democratic regime with a military coup is against international law and against all the principles that we believe in. And the second area that violence gets involved is that they've stated in black and white in their literature that once they establish their state, they will expand and conquer other nations in an offensive war, regardless of whether those nations, this is stated clearly, regardless of whether those nations have attacked them or not. They believe it's their duty.
That entails violence.
That does entail violence. That's not terrorism, though. It's state war. It's warfare. It could even consist of war crimes because it's proactively invading countries. Their aim is to first of all invade all the Muslim majority countries that surround them and eventually declare an offensive war against the world to conquer the entire planet.
If we're talking about a Muslim country, though, if it's already Muslim, what's the need to invade it and overthrow the government?
In their theory, in their principles, they don't consider any society Islamic unless two things occur. One is that the security, i.e. the army, has to be in the hands of Muslims, and the second is that Islam has to be sovereign. Their understanding of Sharia has to be implemented. If that's not the case, they consider it Dar al-Kufr, or the land of apostasy or heresy. And Pakistan for them, including Saudi Arabia, Mecca and Medina, all of these places for them are Dar al-Kufr because they're not ruling by their interpretation of Islam.
And what is their interpretation of Islam?
For example, democracy is kufr. Democracy is entirely against Islam. If you believe in it after being warned, it takes you out of Islam. You apostatize if you believe in democracy in their view. And so fundamentally, any system that is democratic for them is entirely un-Islamic. Secondly, they don't believe in nation states or borders between countries, and therefore the entire voluntary signing up to the UN by member states, a consensus that the world has arrived at through treaties with each other, they don't recognize the validity of that world setup at all, and they will challenge that world order.
According to al-Nabhani's work, the Islamic State, he says that Muslims abroad should work towards turning their land where Islam is not implemented and which thus considered as Dar al-Kufr, as you just mentioned, into Dar al-Islam. That's similar to what we're seeing happening in Pakistan, that the militant insurgency that's being carried out is saying that Sharia should be implemented, but their interpretation of Sharia.
That's right, that's right. And the only difference, and in fact I want to be very clear about this, Hizb ut-Tahrir have been saying this since 1953. They laid the intellectual foundations upon which the current jihadist violent terrorist groups operate. The ideology was laid out by Nabhani in 53. 53 was the first time somebody came out and said every single Muslim majority country is Dar al-Kufr, or a land of apostasy. A society is un-Islamic, even if the majority were Muslim. And I say here even Mecca and Medina, because it wasn't ruling by their interpretation of Islam. That philosophy has now been adopted by jihadists, as you've just correctly mentioned, even here in Pakistan. The only difference between these two types of groups is that the jihadists engage in direct violence and terrorism because they don't want to wait. Hizb ut-Tahrir's form of violence is by organizing military coups.
So then could Hizb ut-Tahrir be considered just one step towards becoming a jihadi organization?
I think the important thing here to recognize is the analogy of it. I think the way I explain it is like a kettle. If you boil water in a kettle for long enough and it reaches boiling point, if the switch doesn't flip, then the water will boil over. Now, they are injecting into society an ideology that runs contrary to everything we have believed in, traditionally as Muslims. To say that Mecca and Medina is now Dar al-Kufr, to say that Pakistan, a majority Muslim country, is Dar al-Kufr, which contradicts the traditional classic Islamic stance on things. If you inject that into society for long enough, even if their members do not engage in terrorism, which in the majority of cases they don't, either individuals will leave the group and become terrorists, as has happened in many instances, or those who adopt that message but don't join the group will form their own jihadist organizations. Briefly, to give you one classic example where that's happened, I served in prison as a member of Hizb ut-Tahrir in Egypt. I was convicted to 5 years in prison. And I spent my sentence with the assassins of the former president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, who was killed in 1981. The majority were executed in that case, but 2 were given life sentences. They personally told me that the man who taught them this Islamist ideology, not Islamic, but Islamist ideology, was a man called Salim al-Rahal, who they told me was a member of Hizb ut-Tahrir. It's a classic case of how, and what happened was he was deported from Egypt, and they were left to their own devices. And after that happened, they then went on to assassinate the president.
Talking about the fact that Hizb ut-Tahrir doesn't accept nations unless they prescribe to their version of Sharia or their form of Sharia and the way a state should be run. In the Quran, as I understand it, it says that a Muslim should respect the law of the land as well as the law of the Quran or the Hadith. So is it a case that, and from your experience, that it's all down to interpretation and how these people interpret and manipulate what they're reading and what they're telling people? It
is all down to interpretation, and the emphasis here should be that their interpretation is actually entirely modern. Their emphasis on a state, their emphasis on sovereignty being for God, their emphasis on legislation being consistent and in fact synchronized with their interpretation of Sharia. All of these ideas are in fact modern European political ideas: statehood, legislation, constitution, sovereignty. They're all modern European political terms. And the interesting thing is what they've done. The founder of HT used to be an Arab socialist. What they've done is they've taken European political thought and imposed it upon Islam, and anachronistically gone back in history and found or discovered sovereignty belongs to God in ancient texts before they even had a concept of sovereignty 1400 years ago. So they're reading modern concepts in ancient texts.
Regarding the group's activities in Pakistan, I mentioned earlier that it sounds very much like what Hizb ut-Tahrir wants is what runs behind the militant insurgency we're seeing in Pakistan, particularly on the western borders. The party or group, it likes to call itself the Liberation Party, the group is active in Pakistan. It even has its own manifesto, doesn't it? It does indeed, and it's been active for over 10 years, and they've had some success in even recruiting from the Pakistani army. When I was in London, when I used to be with Hizb ut-Tahrir, I met army officers who had been recruited to Hizb ut-Tahrir from Sandhurst College, which is where the cream of the crop go to learn military tactics and how to become good officers. We recruited them from there and sent them back to Pakistan. In 2003, they were arrested after being discovered by Musharraf. But that gives a certain level of indication as to how successful it can be and how easy it can be to recruit people. Most of the time, people are caught off guard because what they're expecting to see is an uneducated, unlettered, maybe regressive type Muslim who really can't communicate, where in fact, true to all political Islamists, and I'm not talking here about the cannon fodder suicide bombers,